Good afternoon, PyCon. Welcome to the final talk of the day in this room. Just one quick message before we start. I just wanted to remind you all about the sprints. Please stick around after the closing remarks, and there'll be some messages about sprints. If you would like to lead a sprint, please prepare something no more than 20 seconds and be prepared to give that after the closing remarks. Okay, I would like to present Ruchi Varshney, and she's going to revisit localization for us.
Thanks, everyone. I'm Ruchi Varshney, and today I'm going to be talking about translations evolved. So I decided to rename my talk since I thought it would make a good sequel to what I presented last year. So just wanted to start off with a little introduction about me. I'm a full-stack software engineer at Hearsay Social. We were the company with the blimp, so if you didn't see it, I recommend you watch some videos and you'll find it. I'm based in San Francisco, and Hearsay Social is essentially a business platform for insurance and finance companies. So as a startup, we just signed on a whole bunch of international customers, and we had to basically support our application in a bunch of different languages. The problem is that as an enterprise product, we really have to maintain a high quality bar for translations. And we can't really rely on crowdsourced translations like Facebook and Twitter do. And also, as a small engineering team, we had to work hard on scaling and automating our translation process so that we could focus on our core product. So the real motivation behind this talk is actually automation of translations. So before I jump into automation, I wanted to give some basics so that we can get some context around how Python applications have translations done. So the most common tools for translation are gettext and Babel. The gettext package is available in the standard Python library, and you simply import it and use it to mark a string for translations. The Babel package is an easily pip installable package, and it can be used to localize your dates and numbers pretty easily. And if you're using a web framework like Django or Flask, they provide some really nice wrappers and abstractions around these basic packages and make them really, really easy to use. So once you've marked your strings for translation, you essentially define an extraction for configuration. So this is essentially a config file that's telling Babel how to go about extracting your strings from all your source files. So you essentially mark all the different source file types, and you map it to the Babel functions that are going to be called to actually extract those strings. And once you have your configuration ready, you simply run the pybabel extraction command. So this is just a utility available in the Babel package right out of the box. And you just run it with your config, and you spit it out into a file. And essentially, you'll land up with something that looks like this. So it's just a list of key-value pairs with your strings, and the values are just future placeholders for wherever your translated string is going to go. And then once you have that message file ready to go, you just ship it to your translation service, and the translation service takes their time, runs the translations for all the stuff, and once you get your message file back, you just simply compile it into a binary and integrate it back into your app. And lo and behold, you have a translated website. Well, that seemed relatively easy, but what could go wrong? That seemed really easy. So, well, one thing is latency. You got to wait around for the translation service to do the translations. You've sort of enthusiastically gone out and built out your product, but now you have to extract all the strings, send it to the translation service, and then wait for weeks. And essentially, when you have a bulk of strings like that, you're just going to be waiting forever. So what do? There's potential solutions. You could basically freeze all string changes in your repository till you get your string translations back. But then you want to ship your product really fast, and you don't want to be waiting to get feedback from your customers about all the cool stuff you did. And the string freezes are really kind of impossible to hold up. You're in a continuous deployment environment, and people change code all the time. So there's always a string change that'll somehow sneak past. So what do you do about that? We kind of went down the road of trying to have, feature switches that would turn on the feature for one customer if they weren't using the language that was not translated yet. But then, once you have multiple customers, multiple features, and multiple languages, you're dealing with spaghetti code. So at that point, there's nothing you can do. And also, part of the problem is that when you write Vue code, you have your strings littered in your logic. You have all these strings that are embedded inside the code, and even if you start off with documentation in Django and Flask, it'll automatically point you to writing Vue code that looks something like this. And odds are your code base looks something like this even before you start internationalizing. So what can be done? One thing is to really separate string management from all your logic. So you can build out these string classes that list out all the strings that are related to your feature. And this pattern is mostly followed in mobile programming these days. It's, they have resources, you set out your strings, and the whole dealing with strings is just dealt with separately, and you don't have to deal with it in your code as you would on a daily basis. And the best part about this string class is that as soon as you have your product design or feature design, you can just simply route out all the strings that you would ever see and ship them off for translation even before a single line of code has been shipped. And that's the beauty of it. You've basically overlapped your translation time over your development time, and then any sort of incremental changes happen really quickly, and you're not waiting for weeks for your production translations to come back. So this pattern really helped us keep a really high bar on translation coverage. And I mean, these string classes look really pretty. They make your code look really well factored and designed, so why not do it? Another thing that we really ran into a lot was people would change strings, and then the problem is that, as I showed you in the translation file, your English string is the key to all the translations that the rest of the app pick up. The moment you change this and you run an extraction, your translation's gone. What do? Every string change you make is just going to break that translation. And the problem is it works well for your English customers. They're more than happy to receive a new string, a new updated feature. But then what happens to your international customers? They're just angry to see English strings littered all over the feature. So then, and the thing is, it's even impossible to get your engineering team to go around checking every single language ad hoc when they make a change. So, it's just that when a new engineer comes in and they don't know the whole translation process behind that's going on, they'll assume it's a benign change to make a string change and then go ahead and do that and then unknowingly ruin the experience for your international customers. And even more so if your strings are not separated from your Vue code. People just go about changing strings. So some of the things we've used in the past are Git hooks, and we've really used GitHub a lot for all our code review and integration process. So we've made use of Git webhooks. So the Git hooks are essentially a feature that comes in the box with Git. You can essentially describe a pre or post commit action. And essentially every time an engineer commits something to your repository, it runs this little check on it. So we've done a lot of that, especially with our lint checks and all of that stuff. And a potential way to prevent this string change is to warn the engineer that they've gone ahead and changed a string. But I commit code all the time. That can be really aggressive. I think it's kind of an intrusive behavior to introduce. So what we rely more on are GitHub webhooks. So webhooks are essentially like push notifications from your GitHub repository. So anytime an engineer pushes stuff to their repository, you can get alerts around that. And what we've done in the past is we've essentially set up a little bot that listens for all these webhooks events, and then we use those webhooks to figure out the diff in the code, and then we run a whole bunch of checks on it. So we can run unit tests, a whole bunch of, even as far as doing Selenium tests on every code diff, even before it's merged. So that's kind of the beauty of using webhooks. And what we've done is, in addition to all our unit tests, we've done a translation check. So that essentially goes in and checks for all the stuff that has been changed, and it can warn you if your translation coverage has gone down. And then what you can also do is set up a fake locale. So what we've done is we've set up a fake locale, and we've used a Python package called potpy, which generates these funky translations for us. So we don't even have to wait for real translations to come back. We can do any amount of ad hoc testing just with these auto-generated strings. And that really helps find missing strings as people are, even way before the code has been merged and all these diffs are being generated. And another thing where the string classes help is that if you want a new string, if you want a string change, you simply introduce a new variable in your string class and ship it off for translation. And once that's back, you should update your application logic. So anytime a string change happens, you've propagated it to all of your users. It's not only for the English people. So that kind of works well. The Babel package is really one of the best internationalization Python packages out there, but it definitely has its own quirks. So one of them is that it marks strings as fuzzy. So this is essentially Babel package being smart to find changes in your strings that are minute enough that it doesn't warrant a complete loss of your translation. That's very cool and all, but this is right out of the Flask documentation. It says, if you have fuzzy entries, make sure to check them by hand and remove them before compiling. Oh, that really kills automation. You're going to be manually sifting through these huge message files, trying to remove these fuzzy strings, assuming that your engineers know how to translate. And the worst part of it all is that if you don't actually manually go through all these strings, you'll never fix a bad translation if Babel doesn't do a good job matching it for you. So we want perfect translations. We don't want near-perfect translations generated by Babel. So why deal with them at all? We just tell Babel to not do any fuzzy matching. This has really helped us in making the whole system automatic. And also, we found some other very nifty switches in the Babel package that have really helped us automate a lot more of our translation process. So there's one flag that's called ignore obsolete. And that one essentially helps you keep a clean message file. By default, what Babel will do is any string that's no longer being used in your message file or in your application just gets commented out. So imagine if that's happening repeatedly, you're going to end up with a whole bunch of merge conflicts that you don't want to deal with. So that's really useful. It just cleans out any unused string from your file and makes it easy to sort of ship it around. Another useful one that we found was an add comments flag. And this essentially lets you send instructions to your translator. You simply mark a comment with the translator tag or any tag that you can specifically reserve for your translator instructions. And you simply mark a comment in your source code right above the string that you're translating. And that stuff just gets rolled into your message file and appears as a little instruction for your translators to follow. And that's really useful in preventing further mistranslations of any sort of word that's in your application. And another really convenient one, more like I would say it's been a lifesaver to find the last one. The last one is a keyword flag, and what this one does is that it watches for what are the different import aliases you have for your getText function. So for example, if your engineers are fond of using aliases and they'll go ahead and do import getText as _cool or something, the Babel package by itself is not going to know about that. It's simply statically running through all your files and pulling out all the strings. So if you alias that, it's not going to find it. So to make sure that you have all the strings and you're not missing any translations, you have to sort of list this keyword feature so that Babel knows all the potential aliases that you're going to be using. So we've kind of made some progress towards reducing human intervention in this whole process. But what happens once you've integrated your first bulk load of translations into your app? You know, do you have like one engineer sitting around finding the last translation date, running the whole string extraction process, sending the file to the translation service, waiting, getting it back, putting them back in the application? You know, it's really mundane. I don't think I'd like to do that as an engineer. Well, it's a perfect candidate for automation again. We use our existing continuous integration. So, you know, Jenkins and Travis, whichever one you like. Somehow they seem to have some obsession with guys in mustaches, but whatever. But yeah, so we use these these CI services to really automate all of that mundane work that was going on. So we have a translation upload script that, you know, smartly figures out what date, you know, runs all the translations, extraction commands, and then, you know, dumps it on the, you know, file share of the translation service. And then, you know, at a particular time, there's a download script that's also, you know, checking for file changes and then picks it up. And it's even smart enough to open a pull request, and basically the code flow has just become like a new engineer committing code. And that really has worked very well for us. And we also use our CI services to generate our cool, funky PotPy translations. So at any given time, you know, any engineer doing ad hoc testing will see those funky translations and potentially catch any missing strings. So that's useful as well. So despite all the automation we've done, the translations are still never perfect. You still have to deal with translator error. They introduce syntax errors. They have mistranslations just because they don't have enough context around all the stuff you've done. And also, debugging an internationalization issue is kind of hard. Like, you end up going through the entire stack like you would for any other bug. You go through your JavaScript, you go through your backend code, and then you have this additional thing that you have to check. You have to check whether the string got extracted in the first place, whether it's in limbo with the translation service. And if you have, you know, message files that are not versioned or you don't have dates, the engineer's never going to know where that string is, like what's going on with it. And the worst part of it all is that any expert in your company who may potentially know about languages and who's not an engineer can't really help you, because changing a string in your application requires somebody to write code. So that kind of sucks. And, you know, your customer support team is basically going to be sending you more and more tickets about translation issues. And most of the time, engineers don't want to deal with those kind of problems. Well, say hello to content management. I know it sounds like a very scary term, you know, especially when you've seen these old school content management systems. But nowadays, there's some pretty nifty ones. And, you know, they really get as crazy as you configure them. So if you go with the out-of-the-box implementation, they're really, really easy. You know, they provide a whole bunch of features like, I hope you can see these, but, you know, there's something called translation memory. So it's very smart about remembering all the different translations that have been passed through your application at some point in time. And for instance, if you reintroduce a string, you know, it'll be smart enough to revive that translation and put it back into your application. And you also get amazing versioning. You don't have to deal with, you know, marking your message files with timestamps and all that jazz. And you also just end up saving money with all the translation memory features that you get. And if you're adventurous, you can really set a whole bunch of workflow rules. So, for example, you want somebody to manually screen all the translations that are coming in. You can set up, you know, stages for all the translations between the translator and, you know, all the way down till when it integrates into your application. So that's really useful. And a couple of other really good points about these content management systems is that they have developer APIs. So earlier I mentioned that you could have automated upload and download scripts. These have APIs, so it's even easier to write those scripts. You can write maintainable code that calls these APIs and puts all the translations into the translation management system. It's super user-friendly to the translator because they're able to use a UI and they can look at all this past variants of that string. And you can even go as far as putting in screenshots of parts of your application so that they have context around how to translate those words. So that's really useful. And all of this is happening without having an engineer write a single line of code. Everybody can tweak translations. Your customer support team can come in and tweak the translation till it's correct. And another really, really good feature about the content management system is that your translations are happening continuously. You have almost a string-level granularity in the cycle of translations, so you're not waiting forever for a whole bulk load of strings to come back. And if you ever go down as far as building mobile apps or other versions, other platform-supported applications, these platforms really help get your strings already available in that format. So I think that's been really, really helpful for us so far. So I want to conclude with some of the resources. I have a bunch of my translation upload and download scripts available in a GitHub repo, so you can check those out. And if you want to learn the nitty-gritty of how to do Django or general Python app translations, you can go check the PyCon talk I gave last year, and that should give some really deep context around how to do that. Here are the Python packages I mentioned. So Babel, PotPy is for those funky translations. Polib is a really useful one if you want to build translation checkers and see the state of your message files, what percentage has been translated. You want to build a stats dashboard around what's going on with your translations. That's a really good library to use. And there are a bunch of content management systems out there. So there's SmartLing, which we have used. There's other ones like Transifex, which have known support for Python. I'm not sure about others. And if you don't want to go down the path of paying for that software, you can use something called Django Rosetta, and that provides an open source implementation, and you can essentially tweak it as you like. And with that, I'm ready for questions.
Hi. So on the topic of image files, in sort of a non-ideal world, you may have images that have text embedded in them, or even if you don't, from a marketing sort of point of view, you may want to choose different images to appeal to different cultures, et cetera. Have you guys encountered that problem, and are there particular code strategies that you use for solving that are better than just big if-elif blocks?
We haven't run into the issues of app translations for strings that are embedded in images, but a good way to sort of automate testing around that would be something called Needle. I saw a presentation for it earlier in the talks, I think yesterday, and I think it's essentially a CSS testing framework, but you could use that to sort of establish a baseline for your translations, and any diffs that happen against it will fail a test, so that might be a good way to go.
Hi, great talk.
Thanks.
Could you talk about sharing translations between the backend and the front end? And
sure, yeah.
Maybe also about translating user content, not static content of your application, but the user-generated content.
Oh, sure, yeah. If you're using a framework like Django, there's support for JavaScript translation. So what it'll do is it'll bundle back a JavaScript translation library, and you simply have another message file that's specific to your Django, your JavaScript, domain per se. And what it'll do is it basically make an array of translations available to your front end, and they can sort of pick that up based on what locale is enabled. You can also speed up that process by generating a static JavaScript file, and have your CDNs and stuff cache all of that, and that makes for a much more performant version of that. And you simply do the same thing. You have the same Babel configuration file that extracts your JavaScript and dumps it into another file, and that's available for translation. Sorry, what was the other part of your question?
Well, user-generated content?
Oh, yeah. User-generated content, I think it's pretty tricky, but there's ways to potentially expose database strings to your translators. I believe there's a Django DB gettext or a DB gettext Python library that helps you build a framework around exposing your database strings for translators. And if you have user-generated content stored, you can essentially surface that to your translators and have them use that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, again, thanks for the talk. I've just encountered some problems where different languages would have different endings for pluralizations and basic number ranges. Have you encountered that and solved that somehow?
Yeah, sure. The Babel package is very smart about being locale specific. It essentially has a list of data files that explain the different combinations, like commas or points for decimals and things like that. It's very smart about that. And it's literally a static file that it uses.
So I didn't mean formatting numbers. It's just if you said mostly English just has 0 points, 1 point, 2 points. But some languages, I was working with Czech, for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, they all have a different ending on the word. And then from 6 and above, they have a different ending. So have you ever seen
I haven't personally run into that situation, but I'm almost confident the Babel package has enough of a variety of formats that it supports. It follows something called the CLDR, which is the universal standard for localization files. So I think that might be a good place to start looking.
Okay. And also one other question, have you dealt with, if you have a male or female user, if you're talking to them, do you change the verbs or word endings for them?
It's very interesting. Yeah. I haven't run into that.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks for a great talk, Ruchi.
Thanks.